The moon hung low, casting long, eerie shadows over the dense forest. Maya had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for weeks. The small, secluded cabin nestled deep in the woods promised a peaceful escape from the chaos of her life. It was an old cabin, built from rough-hewn logs, with a small stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the dark forest. It seemed like the perfect place to recharge. But as the night wore on, something about the place started to feel off. She arrived just before sunset, the orange glow of the setting sun painting the trees with long, slanted light. The air smelled fresh and earthy, but as the night fell, the temperature dropped quickly. She built a fire in the hearth, the warmth from the flames casting a cozy glow in the cabin. It felt like the world outside had disappeared, leaving only the soft crackling of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig breaking in the woods. She sat down on the worn couch with a book, the cabin's rustic charm easing her anxiety. But as the evening wore on, Maya began to feel a strange unease creeping in. The wind, which had been blowing earlier, suddenly stopped. The trees stood motionless, and the silence was thick, almost suffocating. It was as though the forest was holding its breath. She shook the feeling off, blaming the isolation. She was used to the quiet, but something about this place made it feel wrong. She tried to focus on her book, but the stillness made it hard to concentrate. It wasn't long before she felt like she was being watched, though when she glanced around, she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as she set the book down, there was a soft knock at the door. Maya froze. It was odd. She hadn't seen anyone else on the road when she arrived, and there were no other houses for miles. Who would be knocking on her door at this hour? Her heart began to race, but she ignored the growing sense of dread and walked to the door. Opening it, she found a man standing on the porch, his figure partially obscured by the shadows. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his brow. His clothes were worn and weathered, as if he'd been traveling for days. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes seemed distant, almost hollow. "Sorry to bother you," the man said in a voice that was low, almost apologetic. "I got lost while hiking and my phone died. Can I come in and call for help? I'll leave as soon as I get a signal." Maya hesitated, a flutter of unease rising in her chest. But there was something about his vulnerability that made her feel guilty for turning him away. He didn't seem dangerous, just odd. She reluctantly nodded, stepping aside to let him in. As soon as he entered, he made himself comfortable, sitting near the fire as if he belonged there. His movements were unnervingly smooth, like he had done this many times before. He didn't seem to notice her discomfort, and he didn't ask any questions about her or the cabin. Instead, his eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail: the books on the shelf, the old photographs on the walls, the cracks in the wooden beams overhead. It was as if he was absorbing everything in the cabin, as though it would all be useful to him. Maya offered him a drink, trying to act normal, but he declined. He didn't seem interested in small talk, and instead, he stared into the flames with an intensity that made her skin crawl. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he spoke again. "You know," he began, his voice softer now, as though sharing a secret, "people say this forest is cursed." Maya blinked, startled. "Cursed?" The man nodded slowly, his lips curling into a faint, unsettling smile. "Yeah, you wouldn't think so at first. It looks peaceful, right? But it's not. Not when you know the truth." Maya's blood ran cold. She laughed nervously, trying to brush off his words. "It's just an old forest. People always tell stories about places like this." The man didn't smile. His expression darkened, and his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. It's not just stories. It's real. You feel it too, don't you? The quiet, the way it watches you, the way you're never truly alone." Maya's hands gripped the edge of the chair, her body stiffening. She felt a growing sense of dread, but forced herself to speak, to break the tension. "What do you mean? This is just a cabin in the woods. There's nothing here but trees and animals." The man's gaze never wavered. "That's what they all think. The ones who come out here alone. They think it's just nature. But the forest, it takes what it wants. It's hungry. And the cabin?" His voice dropped to a whisper. "The cabin's a trap." A chill ran down Maya's spine, and she began to wonder if she had made a mistake letting him in. But before she could ask him to leave, he continued. "You're not the first to stay here, you know. People come and go, and some of them never leave. They think it's all an accident. They think they're just lost. But it's not an accident. The forest chooses who stays." Maya felt a tightness in her chest, like she couldn't breathe. She tried to laugh, but it came out as a nervous chuckle. "Are you telling me that people disappear in these woods?" The man's eyes darkened, and his smile grew more sinister. "No, not disappear. They're taken. Slowly. The trees feed on fear, and once they start, they don't stop." He leaned forward, his breath cold against her skin. "You want to know how it feels? To be taken? To be dragged into the woods, your screams swallowed by the darkness? To be torn apart, slowly, piece by piece?" Maya's blood turned to ice. The words seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating, as though they had weight to them. She stood up quickly, her legs trembling, but he followed, his eyes never leaving hers. "Don't bother running," he whispered. "There's nowhere to go. The forest is always watching. It knows where you are." Her heart hammered in her chest as she backed toward the door, her fingers fumbling for the handle. She wasn't sure what was happening. Was this a twisted game? Was he insane? But then, as she reached for the door, she realized with a sickening lurch that the handle wouldn't turn. The door was stuck, frozen shut. The man stepped closer, his thin, wiry frame looming over her. "You're in my trap now," he said softly, almost lovingly. "And once you're in the forest's grip, you never leave." His face was too close now, his breath rancid and hot against her skin. He reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his fingers like ice. She tried to scream, but her throat constricted. Her vision blurred, and she could feel the temperature drop in the room. The fire was dying, its warmth slipping away like a fading memory. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was his smile. A twisted, cruel grin that stretched unnaturally wide. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the trees whispered their hunger. The forest was awake.